I call this meeting to order. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to meeting 37 of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts.
Standing orders. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Conformément à l'article 108.3G du règlement,
pursuant to Standing Order 108.3G, the committee is studying the spring 2026 reports of the Auditor General of Canada.
From the Office of the Auditor General, Karen Hogan, Auditor General of Canada. Nice to see you again. Jerry DeMarco, the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development. Welcome. Along with Margaret Armutlu, Principal. Nice to see you. Milan Juvnyak, better the second time, I think. Thank you very much for your patience with me. Susie Fortier, nice to see you. And Marie-Pierre Grondet, Director. Nice to see you as well. Ms. Hogan, you and your team will have 5 or some minutes that you require. We'll give you the time you feel you need to present your reports today. Thank you.
Merci. Bonjour, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chair. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to appear before the committee today to discuss our reports that were just tabled. First, I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. With me today is Jerry DeMarco, the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development, who will speak to 3 of the audit reports that my office presented to Parliament this morning. We are also accompanied by the principals who were responsible for the audits. In addition to our performance audit reports, and as is our usual practice, we have also provided Parliament with copies of our special examinations of the National Capital Commission and of the International Development Research Centre, which were made public since our last tabling. I will begin with our audit of initiatives that have been described by the Government of Canada as the new fiscal relationship with First Nations. The government committed to co-developing initiatives with First Nations partners, including increasing the predictability and flexibility of federal funding to support reconciliation and the gradual transfer of services to First Nations.
That Indigenous Services Canada did not effectively implement, monitor, or assess the initiatives it committed to. While the department introduced 10-year grants and payments were aligned with funding agreements, it did not consistently monitor whether grant recipients remained eligible for funding. More than $6.5 billion in grants has been distributed, but the department did not know whether the grants were achieving intended outcomes, including reducing socioeconomic gaps between First Nations and other Canadians. Important initiatives to truly transform the fiscal relationship between First Nations and the federal government remain largely undeveloped. For example, Indigenous Services Canada did not implement a framework to establish mutual accountability between First Nations and their citizens and between First Nations and the department. The department also did not meet its key commitment to support the development of First Nations financial management capacity to avoid financial default. Les initiatives liées à la nouvelle relation financière.
The new fiscal relationship initiatives are an important part of Indigenous Services Canada's mandate to gradually transfer services to First Nations. The department needs to improve how it implements and delivers these initiatives to meet its commitments to help improve socioeconomic outcomes and advance reconciliation. I will now turn to our audit of accessibility in 7 federal organizations. Overall, we found that all had fostered accessible workplaces for employees with disabilities, but key areas for improvement remained. All organizations we examined had made progress in the representation of persons with disabilities in their workforces. And we found that promotion rates across employee groups were comparable, and that all 7 organizations had accessibility practices in place. For example, they had executive champions and networks for persons with disabilities that they had created.
The progress to date in representation and the commitment to accessibility. There is still room for improvement in how accommodations are delivered and employees with disabilities are engaged. For example, we found that employee networks were not consistently consulted on the implementation of decisions affecting them. In addition, while all organizations had measures in place to address workplace barriers, processes to deliver accommodations need to be improved. The time required to respond to employees' accommodation requests range from an average of 24 to 310 days. Inconsistent data collection limited the ability of organizations to identify recurring issues and systemic barriers. Federal organizations have a duty to ensure that all employees can participate fully and equally in the workplace. Building on the progress made to date requires ongoing focus on accessibility and efficient processes. I will now turn it over to the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development to summarize the next 3 reports.
Merci. Le rapport que je...
Thank you. The reports I am presenting today focus on the federal government's efforts to address global challenges posed by climate change and avian influenza. To better protect Canadians now and in the future, stronger action is needed to adapt to our rapidly changing world. Our first audit focused on flood hazard mapping, which is becoming increasingly important as Canada's climate changes. We can no longer rely only on present-day data to prepare for floods. We also need to plan for future climate scenarios, including changing precipitation patterns. This is especially timely given the significant flooding seen in many regions of Canada this spring. Flood hazard maps are a tool to inform residents, developers, and infrastructure planners of the risks of flooding in a given area.
Resources Canada, Environment and Climate Change Canada, and Public Safety Canada were slow to produce and share the flood hazard maps needed to protect communities and support climate change adaptation. Natural Resources Canada did not ensure that mapping efforts prioritized higher risk areas. Many maps remain incomplete, and much of the existing mapping information is not practical or usable. The Department is also not on track to make all maps currently in production publicly available by the target year of 2028. We also found that Public Safety Canada planned flood risk awareness portal did not integrate climate change considerations or allow information to be easily updated as conditions change. This means that information in the portal will not reflect changes to flood risks over time. Climate change projections and easily available flood maps are needed to reliably inform long-term planning decisions, such as where to build homes or develop infrastructure. Canadians face escalating risks and higher disaster recovery costs in the absence of up-to-date information. Notre prochain audit a révélé des lacunes.
In our next audit, we found significant gaps in the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat's oversight of the greening government strategy. to strengthen the climate resilience of federal services and federal assets, which are valued at about $100 billion. We found that the framework to track progress was weak. Also, despite repeated commitments, the Secretariat did not publicly report on climate resilience in the 8 years that followed the strategy's launch in 2017. These gaps hindered decision-making and accountability. At the organizational level, the audit examined how National Defence, Public Services and Procurement Canada, and Fisheries and Oceans Canada assessed climate risks and acted to enhance the climate resilience of their assets, services, and activities. Together, these three departments manage more than 2/3 of the federal government's physical assets, such as buildings and bridges. We found that they had made limited progress in translating risk assessments into meaningful action.
This lack of progress has clear environmental and financial consequences for Canadians. As Canada warms at twice the global average, accelerating efforts to protect federal assets and services will sustain communities and save taxpayers' money over time. For example, small harbors, which directly support more than 45,000 jobs, are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and require immediate repairs and reinforcement. Our final audit assessed the federal response to avian influenza. An outbreak of the disease began in Canada in 2021, and there were concerns the virus could mutate and become more easily transmissible. While Environment and Climate Change Canada, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and the Public Health Agency of Canada took action to prevent and manage outbreaks of avian influenza, we found that they needed to improve on planning, documentation, and the management of human vaccines to better prepare for future threats to public health and vulnerable wildlife. Par exemple, l'Agence canadienne des...
For example, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency successfully implemented procedures to eliminate the virus from all 47 premises in our audit sample. However, there were some weaknesses in the agency's documentation of its activities. We also found that Environment and Climate Change Canada redirected funding to expand its surveillance of migratory birds following the 2021 outbreak, but without dedicated funding, this activity may not be sustainable in the long term. In addition, the department did not target surveillance on the virus's impact on at-risk species that are or could become threatened, endangered, or extinct.
We found that the Public Health Agency of Canada secured vaccines for people at higher risk of exposure, such as farmers and veterinarians, but purchasing decisions were not supported by sufficient analysis. This led to an oversupply, and more than 95% of the purchased vaccine doses expired before they could be used. I will now turn it back to the Auditor General. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you. Across these audits, a consistent pattern emerges. Programs are in place, funding is being delivered, and risks are known. But weaknesses in implementation and monitoring affect the achievement of results. This is not a new pattern. I raised similar concerns at the midpoint of my mandate last year about long-standing issues in how federal programs are designed, delivered, and measured, including in areas affecting First Nations. Notre audit des nouvelles initiatives financières.
Our audit of the new fiscal initiatives shows that when a department does not act on its commitments intended to address long-standing issues, it falls short on delivering critical outcomes, such as advancing reconciliation. Our audit of avian influenza also highlights similar issues in a different context. I'm concerned that despite experience from past public health events, including the COVID-19 pandemic, gaps in planning, data, and decision-making have not been addressed and continue to affect preparedness. Mr. Chair, this concludes our opening remarks. We would be happy to answer any questions the committee might have. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, tous les deux.
Thank you both.
Consists of 3 members, 6 minutes each. Ms. Kuzi, you'll lead us off, please, for 6.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much, Auditor General, for being here today and for your team being here today. And you expressed in your opening statement the exact frustration I'm feeling here today. I know my Conservative colleagues are feeling here today, and as well as Canadians should be feeling here today in terms of consistent problems which are not being fixed. I'm going to focus today on accessibility in the public service. The summary includes statements such as there are ineffective processes to handle the volume of requests. They did not consistently collect data about the requests. Not all organizations tracked resolution times. On page 14 of this report, it talks of missing date information. At the Public Service Commission of Canada, 90 records did not include the date when accommodation requests were returned to the office, were submitted, or when they were addressed. There was an inconsistent approach to record a request closure. At the Canada Revenue Agency, dates recorded as closed sometimes included monitoring periods after the accommodation was provided. We found that this made the closing date an imprecise indicator of accommodation request resolution. Missing types of accommodation at Employment and Social Development Canada, 14% of the records were missing the information describing the measure implemented. This limited the analysis of requests by type of solution implemented. On page 16, Exhibit 4 states, the organizations that had informal goals or tracked timelines to address accommodations requests had faster resolutions. No kidding. Auditor General, I'm going to go back to your GC Strategies report, which was issued almost exactly a year ago, today, plus a month, June 10th, 2025, where you indicated the findings in this audit echo those of previous audits where we found deficiencies. So a year later, I am referring, and you are saying you are finding deficiencies. We are referring to a report a year ago which said there was a pattern of deficiencies. Here specifically in GC Strategies, how public servants applied federal procurement rules. You have said time and time again, the government need only follow and apply the rules, or in this case, the processes. And again, the public service seems incapable of doing so under the leadership of the government. So my question is to you, when will this government learn how to learn from your reports and apply the recommendations of the reports throughout the public service? It's beyond frustrating at this point, since we seem to repeat the same process of you coming here indicating your frustration and disappointment in the actions of the public service under this government to carry out what should be simple processes, rules, and regulations. Can you respond to that, please?
I mean, you raise many examples, and I'm not sure which ones to pick to answer. I guess what I would focus
There are so many, unfortunately. My apologies for interrupting.
What I would focus in on is there's two different situations here. When it comes to responding to a health crisis, I think the government over many years has lived through different crises, whether it be H1N1 or SARS or the COVID-19 pandemic. We saw that we were repeating recommendations to resolve issues between data sharing and information sharing with the provinces and territories and the federal government, to be better prepared, to take the time to invest in preparedness, and to use fulsome data to make decisions. We saw some of those same concerns being repeated when we looked at the avian flu. Very different, I think, when you look at accessibility in the public service, however. This is a journey that began once the Accessibility Act was in law in 2019. We saw some progress, and the issues that you raise there, however, are about accommodation. And I think many departments have not put a formalized structure around duty to accommodate requests, and that's why we're seeing very varying outcomes there. And this is something as basic as removing a barrier to ensure that a public servant can participate fully and equally in the workplace. And waiting almost 300 days is way too long. And so I would expect that every department and agency will look at this report on accessibility and look at themselves and see if they need to make progress. I can tell all the committee members here that I put my own office through the same questions, and we have areas that we can improve in, very much like the departments we audited, and in some cases we're doing better. But I think it's about every deputy head focusing in on what they can improve within their organization when it comes to accessibility.
On a similar note, Auditor General, on page 18 of the report, it states a critical factor influencing these disparate experiences was identified as the individual's direct supervisor and immediate line of management. This is seen consistently across satisfaction in jobs, this primary factor. But as well, it was reported that there is a lack of meaningful engagement outside of required touch points in terms of the evaluation of this program across departments. But what this really speaks to me, Auditor General, is leadership, having compassion and care for these individuals, for this community. And in both of these quotes that I've just given, there seems to be a lack of this. What does this say about the leadership of this government relative to these accommodations of this community?
So I would like to clarify that accessibility is not a program. Every employer has a responsibility, especially in the public service, a duty to ensure that all employees can participate fully and equally in the workplace. You're absolutely right that a supervisor it has the biggest impact on an individual in a workplace, the person that you report to every single day. And what we found is there was varying degrees of awareness across supervisors about accessibility concerns, especially if a disability was an invisible disability. And we saw that departments didn't consistently require training in this area. That's just a first place to start. And more importantly, the government had put in place an accessibility passport, which was supposed to be a tool that employees can use to support a dialogue with their supervisor. But there's very inconsistent application of or use of the passport. Lack of awareness, in fact, across many of the supervisors. And that passport's supposed to help a person as they might move around the public service to not have to keep repeating what they need, so that every employer and supervisor knows how to support them better. So I think the government's or the public service is on a beginning of this journey, but it is time now to invest some time and energy in making sure that the experience of every employee, whether they identify as having a disability or not, is equaled and level, and that they can fully participate.
Thank you very much. That is your time. Next is Ms. Tester Dirksen, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the whole team being here today to once again answer our questions. And it's now my third time participating in the release of new reports, and I feel like I'm starting to get the hang of it a little bit. So bear with me while I go through some questions. I do want to address my colleague Ms. Cusey's comments about recurring themes, which I've also noticed, and certainly it's frustrating as elected people when we see the intention of policies at a high level not necessarily filtering down and impacting people the way they're meant to. So it really speaks to, I think, the rubber hitting the road and the impact and the implementation not quite reaching the goals that we always intend for it. That being said, I want to be fair in noting that there are improvements made in different areas over time, and that we're constantly working to better ourselves. And the work that you do, Ms. Hogan, at your office with your team is so critical to making sure that those departments are held accountable and making sure that they're constantly improving. So I do want to reference first the new fiscal initiatives with First Nations report, and specifically with respect to the default prevention and management policy. So your report had noted that the first two levels of what I would call accountability oversight had been removed. Do we know why those had been removed?
So those were removed so that there would be more flexibility and control by First Nations in how they might navigate certain financial difficulties. And the last level was left in place as an interim measure where they would bring in a third party to help manage if there was significant financial default. But it was really to give the responsibility and the power back to First Nations communities.
Okay, so when you say giving responsibility and power back to First Nations communities, that I would interpret that as the overarching goal of self-governance of First Nations communities and an important step in that way. So would it be fair to say that those levels that had been removed were contravening the principle of self-determination? Was that the impression you had gotten?
Well, I think that would be a question to ask why it was repealed, but the default prevention management policy was then supposed to be replaced, and I think what it was supposed to be replaced with is even more important. It was meant to help create and bolster capacity in First Nations communities, and while they've removed what many First Nations communities may not have appreciated about that policy, they haven't taken the step which will really have a difference, which is making sure that capacity to avoid financial management issues or default is bolstered in communities, and that's one of the commitments that is largely undeveloped right now.
Okay, thank you for that. I want to talk a little bit as well about the mutual accountability framework. And one of your findings had said that replacing the First Nation Financial Transparency Act with a mutual accountability framework, you found that ISC had not created the framework. Basically. So, and I think in your report you also referenced that some First Nations were not necessarily satisfied with the draft and that it didn't quite engage First Nations to the extent that it should. It wasn't adequate enough in engaging them in them being the drivers of those outcomes. So can you comment a little bit about that and how you see the delay in what appears to be maybe a breakdown in the negotiation, how that's affecting the implementation of improvements?
So this is an area where we actually saw some collaboration with First Nations partners and the department, and they were co-creating what a mutual accountability framework would look like. I would sort of give you a visual that it looks a bit like a triangle. You would have First Nations being accountable to their own citizens, but then also having First Nations and the government being accountable to each other. So a nation-to-nation type of accountability. And the first step was to sort of create a way to measure what that would look like. So how would you measure if socioeconomic gaps had closed? And there was a lot of dialogue and discussion, but then the department went away and came up with measures. And I think that's where the First Nations said, well, we want to help define how to measure what closing a socioeconomic gap might look like, and that it shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all type of solution. So it was a step in the right direction, but then a step back to the usual way of doing things, and I think that's why we saw it being paused and stalled.
Okay, it's very, very valuable insight. I want to turn to Mr. DeMarco and your flood hazard mapping report. When I was a municipal councillor, I sat on the board of our local conservation authority, and we engaged quite a bit with floodplain mapping. Our community exists, very dense parts of it exist within floodplains, so we always had questions from developers and people wanting to make changes to properties. We engaged with some LIDAR technology to establish new mapping and ended up actually expanding the floodplain to a significant extent. So the first question I have about your report, in the overall message portion, you note that Public Service Canada has a portal to help identify flood risks, but that the portal does not consider climate change projections, which is surprising. And your report notes that the risk ratings are based on, quote, present-day assumptions related to flooding. Would you mind indulging me in explaining what you mean by present-day assumptions?
So thank you for the question. Canada's climate is changing, and it's changing more rapidly than the global average. Present day, historically, we could plan for floods by looking back and looking at history and records. We used to say, oh, there's a 100-year flood line, and that was based on history. But with our climate changing, we need to, as best as possible, create scenarios about what the future may look like and plan for that instead of just looking back. And so that the fact that the portal is being produced and to try to to democratize this information and make it accessible to Canadians is good. But if it doesn't have the capability of being updated easily, and it doesn't have the capability for users to select climate change scenarios in the mapping, then its utility is limited. It is more like what we've been doing in the past in terms of looking back to plan for the future, which there's nothing wrong with that in a relatively stable climate. But with a changing climate, we need to factor in as much as possible, recognizing that there is a degree of uncertainty, what future rainfall patterns will be, what future flooding will occur along rivers and lakes. And I would have expected that the portal, being an initiative being undertaken in a time where Canada recognizes the need to adapt to climate, that it would have that capability.
Thank you. I'm afraid that is the time, Ms. Tester-Dirksen. Suivant, c'est Michel Lemire, s'il vous plaît. Ou Michel Bonnet.
Then we'll have Mr. Lemire, or rather Mr. Bonnet. Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the Auditor General and the Commissioner. At the Bloc Québécois, about a year ago, we had made a report to kind of cost the effects of climate change for individuals and the government. To us, it's clear that regardless of what happens internationally, if we ignore climate change here, the impacts will not go away. With your report today, Mr. Commissioner, you've talked about the costs. There's an increased cost associated with flooding, notably. And again, the government has made commitments, but without seeing the results that we want to see in terms of adaptation and resiliency. Given your analysis and also the report that you published last year on adaptation, do you think that the government is not taking the climate crisis seriously enough and is, in fact, increasing the bill that is going to be left to Canadians down the road? And, of course, also allowing more crises to happen in the future. Is that your analysis, that what we don't do now will have a cost later? Yes, if we invest now, it will cost less for future generations to adapt to climate change. In the National Adaptation Strategy, we published a report on that last year. Every dollar spent on a given adaptation measure can lead to savings of $13 to $15. That's just an estimate, but it gives an idea of what we can do now, not only to adapt to climate change, but to save taxpayer money for the future. If we act immediately, we will be more resilient, and we will better be able to optimize resources from taxpayers. Now, in the 2026-2027 budget, Environment and Climate Change Canada is actually going to reduce its spending on adaptation and resiliency by around $500 million compared to the previous year. So these are essentially cuts. There's less money left for adaptation. Does that concern you, that the government is investing $530 million less in adaptation? Well, one of the things we found in our report last year is that it was difficult to find an overall figure that was being spent on adaptation measures. So I can't comment precisely on the number that you are using. But we need to have resources for adaptation, and if we spend that money now, it will cost less in the future. We also need to have a system to determine whether those investments are yielding results. With today's report, we've seen that there has been a lot of analysis, but not a lot of results when it comes to federal assets. I know you don't want to say anything about the $530 million figure, but what about the principle? I mean, if a government is cutting from one year to the next what's being spent on adaptation, do you feel that that is responsible? Well, the government is the one that makes decisions about what is in the budget. We look at the results that they're getting with the amount that they are spending. And we check to see if they are using those resources efficiently and using it to create resiliency when it comes to federal assets, and whether they are effectively protecting Canadians. But it is the government's choice in terms of how much to spend. I'm sorry, I don't have much time. I understand that there are essential assets that were identified by the federal government. 200 and some of them are exposed to significant risk. And you say that only 3% of those assets does the government actually have a resiliency plan. So the government delayed its targets from 2022 to 2035. Do you consider that to be responsible? And would you say that there is a risk involved in kicking those commitments down the road? Yes, as you can see in item 8 here, only 3% of those assets, of those essential assets, have that plan. And in fact, you really need to zoom in to even see that 3% that actually have a resiliency plan. So yes, absolutely, they need to accelerate their risk analysis and have more resiliency plans actually implemented. Briefly, the 3% is for essential assets. Should we imagine that the same 3% applies to other services and activities, that only 3% of them would have resiliency plans? My colleague might be able to answer you on that.
Non, ça n'a pas été évalué de la même.
No, that wasn't evaluated the same way. There was work done specifically for essential federal assets. Otherwise, we looked at things more generally, but what we've seen generally is that it takes a lot of time to move from analysis to concrete action on the ground. Thank you very much.
Second round, which will consist of 5 members of various times. Monsieur Dattel, s'il vous plaît, pour 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Salutations.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Welcome to the witnesses. We're here at Public Accounts, first and foremost, to ensure that taxpayer money is properly invested and well managed. There was another scathing report from the AG today, and it has to do with First Nations and a program which, once again, looks very objective and full of noble objectives, but we're still waiting to see results. So and there's significant mismanagement as well. In the report, we've learned that out of $6.5 billion spent over the last 10 years on First Nations, there was no follow-up in terms of implementation. Things were not properly evaluated. And I know that over $6.5 billion was invested, but the department couldn't say if it was getting the desired results. Notably, the reduction of socioeconomic indicators when you compare First Nations individuals and other Canadians. So $6.5 billion over the last 10 years spent by this government. And they're not able to clearly assess the positive impacts on First Nations. Ms. Hogan, how can we convince Canadians that they should continue to pay taxes if they're not getting any results for their money? I think when it comes to the new fiscal relationship with First Nations, it's important to note that this is not new money. This is the same money that is just taking a new form. the transformational elements of this relationship are underdeveloped. The government committed to using the Community Well-Being Index to determine whether socioeconomic gaps between First Nations communities and other communities were actually being reduced. In our opinion, that is not the right index to be using. First of all, it doesn't target grants. It doesn't target the 10-year grants that these initiatives are based on. And the index is only published every 5 to 6 years. So we recommended that the government use all of the information that it already has from First Nations communities to try to find better targets to evaluate the results. Every time, I want to see every time $1 is spent, that there is accountability for that. Now, looking at the public service here, paragraph 15, you say that public servants in the department said that they didn't have enough money to implement these indicators or to do that evaluation. So, Ms. Hogan, last week we learned that $24 million was spent by this government on First Nations. That's an 85% increase since 2018. And public servants are saying they don't have enough money. So where's the problem? Is the money being mismanaged, or are they not being efficient enough in their use of the resources? Well, there are a lot of deep causes for this. Often when you evaluate programs that deal with Indigenous communities, there's a lot of money but a lack of measurement indicators to really see if results are happening. One of the key commitments to transform the relationship with First Nations was having more support to help First Nations increase their capacity for fiscal management. But that's the element that's missing here. You know, last year, in the sort of midterm review, I had called on the government to change the way they work with First Nations communities. And I was very hopeful that these new initiatives would work, but I feel that they've missed the mark. The goal was to provide predictable, stable funding, but it didn't really succeed in transforming the relationship or evaluating whether those socioeconomic gaps were being reduced. Thank you very much for your testimony, Ms. Hogan. You look at every dollar that's being spent, and I think your verdict is clear. After 10 years of this government, we haven't seen the results that we should be seeing. And for everyone paying taxes, everyone who wants to help First Nations, unfortunately, this doesn't seem to be working. The first victims of this mismanagement and this lack of accountability are the First Nations themselves. I will never stop repeating that. I am very proud to represent First Nations in my community, like the Wendake. They are extraordinarily dynamic and they work hard with other First Nations. And they want this to work. There are people who are working on this and trying to make it work. But after 10 years of the Liberal government, they've been left disappointed. Next, Ms. Ship, you have the floor.
For coming back for the spring reports, and it's very nice to see Mr. DeMarco here today. My question is in regards to the avian flu. So the audit showed that there were 870,000 doses of avian flu vaccine, and, well, rather, only 95% of these doses were not used, and they were expired by February 2026. What happened there?
So avian flu was not easy to predict. So federal government was faced with an emerging risk and decided to move quickly to acquire doses for at-risk individuals, such as farmers and veterinarians, without having conducted much of an analysis as to how much was really needed. It purchased 500,000 doses and a small portion of those were being used. There was not that much uptake, and before they were ready to purchase more doses, they did complete a more detailed analysis and determined that they only needed 300,000 doses in total, yet they purchased another 370,000 on top of the 500,000 that had already been purchased. So we had an extreme oversupply. And when those doses expired just 2 months ago, 95% had gone unused.
Why was there a duplication of ordering? Was it the tracking was not there?
Perhaps if we return here with the departments alongside us, they can help explain their course of action. But even with hindsight, it is questionable as to why they were increasing their inventory when the existing inventory was being used at such a low rate. Why they did that is, the department is best positioned to answer that. But it's easy to look at the past and talk about the mistakes that were made. But as Auditor General Hogan mentioned, these aren't one-off mistakes in terms of management of vaccines. Going back to COVID and SARS and H1N1 and so on. Let's learn from these instances and do a better job before the next emergency to be ready. And that's the focus of our recommendation in this audit.
So perhaps it was good that they were conscious of a need for the vaccine and the concern is there. And you mentioned about learning from this, and what are some of the learnings that could be applied?
So in particular, we'd like the Public Health Agency of Canada, and this is our recommendation 72, to improve its systems and procedures regarding vaccine stockpiles, including on their use and distribution, and to collaborate more by implementing a plan with provinces and territories to secure data sharing agreements for monitoring vaccine use so that they have a better handle of the uptake rate and so on, as well as better able to manage the safe distribution and storage and to minimize wastage. So the agency has agreed to that recommendation. It remains to be seen whether they will act on it in a way that prevents our office from having to do another report of this sort of nature in respect of the next time there is a large procurement of vaccines.
Thank you. Ms. Hogan, one of the reports finding notes that Indigenous Service Canada has not yet developed a mutual accountability framework. However, this finding did not come with an accompanying recommendation. Can you elaborate why this is?
So I'm a firm believer in not issuing recommendations that say do what you already committed to do. Here there is a commitment to co-develop a mutual accountability framework. They've begun that work, and it's stalled a little because First Nations communities wanted to be able to be the ones who drove what the outcomes would look like, and that it's not a one-size-fits-all for every First Nations community. And so I believe they know what they've committed to doing, and they need to act on it.
In terms of accessibility to the public service, what is the most important recommendations for all 7 of the organizations to implement?
So I would tell you there was good progress when it came to fostering a workplace that was accessible for individuals with disabilities, but we highlighted 2 areas that need to be worked on. First is better consultation with peoples with disabilities. The principle in the Accessibility Act of nothing about us without us needs to become almost second nature in the day-to-day of all the departments and agencies. And then the second would be to really improve the process that is there to accommodate individuals so they can fully and equally participate in the workplace. A workplace should be designed with accessible by default, but in that absence and in the interim till everyone can get there, duty to accommodate processes are how individuals are supported. And we saw varying degrees at how those requests were handled, from 24 days to up to over 300. That's a really long time to wait for something to just participate in the workplace. I think the last thing I would tell you is that while we only audited 7 departments and agencies, I would expect that every deputy head would be looking at the recommendations and our results here. We are all part of the public service. And everyone can learn from some of these findings and recommendations to improve their workplace.
Thank you. That is your time. Suivant, c'est Michel Lemire pour 2 minutes 30 secondes, s'il vous plaît.
We have Mr. Lemire. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Auditor General and Commissioner, once again for these excellent reports that really highlight important needs. I want to focus on the avian flu report. The Public Health Agency of Canada intended to buy 800,000 doses before even analyzing its needs. It bought 500,000 in 2024, ultimately determined that it only needed 300,000. But then the agency went forward and bought even more with no reason in March of 2025. So how can you explain that the Public Health Agency of Canada would continue to buy additional vaccine doses? One of the major issues was how much this cost. I looked briefly, and AI said that it was several dollars per dose. So we're talking about between $2 and $10 million essentially being flushed down the toilet. Mr. Chair, I'd like to know if it's possible to get the Public Health Agency of Canada to tell us in writing the total cost of that contract for those vaccines. I understand the contract is confidential, but there is a cost aspect here. And if 95% of the doses were indeed thrown out, is that because of bad planning or the government's inability to estimate correctly? Thank you. In the initial stages, there was a lot of uncertainty. So the government made decisions quickly. But as I said in English earlier, buying a further 370,000 doses when they knew that the first acquisition of 500,000 didn't have a lot of uptake is difficult to explain. And it's not up to us to explain it. That would be up to the Public Health Agency. So perhaps they will be here later to explain that. As I said before, we need to try to learn lessons from this so that we can better avoid such a waste in the future. That's the main recommendation to the government. So, you know, we lived through a pandemic, and I remember when Justin Trudeau used to talk about, you know, the 10 million doses and doing everything possible. And clearly we didn't learn from that experience. So if you look at all that money that we spent with all of those unused doses, it's alarming. How do we not have the IT capacity to be able to track and monitor vaccine supply after living through a pandemic? So we are making these same observations today, which are similar to the observations we made previously. It's really up to the Public Health Agency to draw lessons from this and to look at the different crises and, you know, to take action now rather than waiting for the next one. Thank you.
Mr. Stevenson, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. As a CPA, having the Auditor General and her team here is like Christmas for me, so I'm happy to have you here. I would actually encourage us to. We've got 5 reports, and there's far too much information for us to ask 5 minutes, and that's why we're all over the map here today with various questions. But I'm going to focus on the Indigenous initiative, financial initiatives part of it. We've had previous conversations about. In 2016-17, they were to have the eligibility criteria to get in there. They were supposed to be co-developed. I'd ask if we could possibly have that list. We can just have that sent to us in there in writing. Has that criteria changed? So when I look at your information, there's approximately 30% of the Indigenous groups across Canada are actually participating in this 10-year planning. Has it evolved over time, or will it be evolving, or is the eligibility part fixed?
I thank you for your kind words. I can tell you my kids aren't happy when mom shows up, but at least you are here. I would tell you I already have the eligibility criteria in writing. They're included in our report in paragraph 23. They were co-developed with First Nations colleagues in the department, and there are two that were initial eligibility criteria. So the organizations needed to have a financial administration law or a bylaw to govern their finances, and then they also had to meet certain financial performance measures. And the decision was that that would be evaluated by looking at audited financial statements. Then there was ongoing criteria where a set of audited financial statements needed to be provided to the First Nations financial management
annual requirements.
Needed to be provided to the First Nations Financial Management Board, that they would assess whether or not certain metrics were met, like a debt to equity ratio and so on.
They are separate from the annual versus the initial one.
Correct. The initial is the first. The initial was to apply for the grant and get it. And we looked at all 191 applicants, and they were all eligible for the grant. Then the annual monitoring is where we see some gaps. So the First Nations Financial Management Board would take the financial statements and then provide a summary report to the government indicating whether the financial indicators annually had been met. And that's where there's gaps, where only 40% of the files had every year as report. Others had gaps of a year here or there, and 6 that we looked at had no reports whatsoever.
So in your review of those, was any of the groups ever removed from the program because they failed to follow the criteria or didn't meet the criteria, or was in their funding, or anything ever changed with regards to that?
So none of the organizations whose files we reviewed were removed from the program. When we asked for the Indigenous Services Canada how come there were files missing, we also spoke to the First Nations Financial Management Board, and we were explained that it was a lack of capacity in many cases in some of the First Nations communities to just create financial statements on an annual basis, and then access to auditors to be able to audit those. And this speaks to the importance of really building up that capacity that is needed in First Nations communities to continue to meet the ongoing requirements.
So were there any consequences other than just getting more information? Are there any consequences for any of the participants when they didn't meet the criteria?
So the program wasn't designed that way, but I would say that this was a co-development on deciding that these were going to be measures that could be met. And if it's not working for First Nations communities in the department, then I would encourage them to sit back down together and see what it would take to make sure that that mutual accountability, which is a two-way street from First Nations to the government and vice versa, is created and maintained.
So further down, you talked about the Community Well-Being Index and how it's not a good measure, and that it was only every 5 to 7 years. So if it was only every 5 to 7 years, what were they evaluating their outcomes on? Or were they evaluating their outcomes at all based on what you were finding there?
This was one of our findings where we said that they weren't assessing whether the initiatives had met its intended outcomes. So at the outset, the department set the Community Wellbeing Index as a metric they would use to see whether the socioeconomic gap between First Nations communities and other Canadians had been closed. This is a metric that's done by Statistics Canada, and while it's broken down between Indigenous communities and other Canadian communities, it was last issued in 2021. So it's been 7 years.
Hard to evaluate whether you've done a good job or not if you can't have
Which is
goals.
exactly why we recommended an annual assessment. There's lots of information already collected from First Nations communities. The department needs to figure out a better way to determine whether this grant, which can't be targeted by the Community Wellbeing Index, is actually making a difference.
Thank you. That is your time. And Mr. Ma, for 5 minutes, please. You'll finish it up here today.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the Auditor General's folks here. My questions will be focused on the flood hazard mapping. Commissioner, your report includes a number of constructive recommendations, so thank you very much. Can you speak to the importance of flood hazard mapping, where flooding is the most common and costly natural disasters?
Yes, thank you. And as you see from the first exhibit in our report, it's not only the most costly, but the cost to the federal government for flood relief has been escalating quite rapidly over the last few decades. So in order to try to get a handle on that, why not plan better for the future and try to avoid the construction of new infrastructure, new housing, and so on in areas that may well, with climate change, become hazard areas. So the whole point of this is really being safe rather than sorry with respect to new infrastructure. We have a lot of infrastructure that's already prone to flooding, and there's different programs in place to deal with that. But really, this is about investing the resources now in preventing future disasters resulting from the construction of infrastructure in areas that we should have avoided. So if flood mapping produces good high quality maps that are usable for all users, whether it's a new home buyer, a housing developer, or a public infrastructure planner, what we would see is newer information that doesn't just look at the past in determining where we shouldn't build, but does scenario planning into the future to try to predict. There's a lot of uncertainty, but try to predict as much as possible which areas to avoid and be safe rather than sorry.
So to that point, do you feel the department could use newer tools or more advanced tools, including possibility of AI to help that predictability of the weather changes?
So with respect to the information that's supposed to be available to Canadians through the portal, public safety does need to upgrade what type of information is made available. So right now, the portal that's being launched as we speak, there's a shell of it that's come up on the internet the last couple of days. It doesn't have the capability of users saying, okay, with a changing climate, what should I plan for? It just looks back. So that's whether they use AI or any other tools, it is possible to incorporate that information, even if there is subject to uncertainty. So that would be one area of improvement. With respect to the regulatory maps, the more detailed, higher resolution maps that Natural Resources Canada is helping to fund, then we already know that Environment Canada can assist in that process in providing data that would help incorporate climate change considerations into those, what we call regulatory level mapping.
Thank you. So could you describe how federal department are working with the provinces and territories on flood hazard mapping, and why that collaboration is essential for the success of this?
Yeah, so on the positive side, the fact that the federal government is assisting in this endeavor is a good thing, because land use planning is primarily a provincial and territorial matter. The federal government has stepped up and said, we're going to assist with this with the funds that we're talking about in this report. That's good, but that's not an excuse to do it inefficiently or in a way where that doesn't triage high-risk areas and so on, or doesn't incorporate climate change. So our report is all about, let's accelerate these efforts and do it in a way that will create reliable and actionable information on which Canadians can rely in planning major purchases. For example, buying a house, that may be the most important financial decision that a family makes. It would be a shame if 10 years down the road, that area is deemed to be flood prone, but it wasn't known at the time of purchase. So accelerating these efforts will make it better for everyone.
That's great. Thank you. In your view, though, how important is it to have a coordinated national approach? I think you've touched on this a little bit, such as this program, to ensure consistency and coverage across a large geographical country like Canada?
Yeah, so it's a balance, recognizing that there are differing standards across the provinces and territories, but there should be a bare minimum level of accessible information for Canadians. That's the theory behind Public Safety's portal. but the portal is, as I mentioned, doesn't incorporate climate change and is difficult to update. I am happy to see the recommendation about improving that portal has been accepted, and in the response from public safety, you see that they are embarking on a more open source tool to use that would be more useful for Canadians in the future. It remains to be seen what that will look like. All we have right now is their response, but if we come back for a hearing, then perhaps the department can provide a more of an explanation as to what their intentions are with a revised portal.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to our witnesses for their testimony and participation in relation to the 2026 Spring Report to the Auditor General of Canada. I'm going to excuse the witnesses and suspend this meeting. We'll come right back in camera as quickly as we can. Witnesses are excused. Thank you again and have a great day. This meeting is suspended.
you.